to musician and author Geoff Lewis. Geoff, you're the author of Cultural Studies, so you're in a pretty good position to tell us about culture. What is culture?
Hello. There are three common definitions of the word culture. The first of them uses culture as synonymous with the arts. It effectively means that to be cultured is to know and experience and to produce art, fine art, usually high art. Now the great problem with that definition is that it tends to restrict culture and the expressive and creative modes of culture to particularly elite groups, people who are especially gifted, people who are inspired in some way, who have special aptitudes and skills, who can create culture, that is, create art, and on the other side, those specially gifted people who can understand it and consume it. The second definition of culture that's commonly used is one that derives from anthropology. Now, anthropology used the concept of culture to refer to a particular social group's practices, rituals, belief systems, laws, and material culture. It usually referred to tribal groups, and tribal groups were particularly durable social groups which had a high level of integration and were quite homogeneous in their belief systems and practice systems. Now, that's fine for a group of people who are going to last, as with the Indigenous Australians, for 40,000 years in their cultural practices. But in modern, advanced, industrialised societies, where culture is dynamic and changing all the time, where people's rituals and practices, belief systems are complicated and diverse, the word culture has had to adapt and be adapted in various ways. Now, it was the Birmingham Centre for Contemporary Cultural Studies who first recognised this, and they believed that the word culture, as apropos meaning systems of a social group, should apply to all sorts of social groups, not just the elite. So all peoples across a social group or a society had culture. They recognised in the first instance that the working class had a culture. They had their own expressive modes, their own practices, belief systems and so forth, their own meaning-making practices and processes. As their work developed, of course, they realised that it wasn't just the working class, but there are other groups as well. Different racial groups have a culture. Different sexually oriented groups have a culture. Youth have a culture. So the Birmingham Centre and all the people who have followed in their wake have recognised that in industrial advanced societies that different social groups now have their own meaning-making processes. And to make this more clear, I would define culture, and certainly the way I've used it in my writings, in my work, I would define culture as the meaning-making and meaning-making processes of a given social group.
So Geoff, how's the media implicated in culture?
Now that's a very good question. The media is a major generator and producer of texts, and texts are those kinds of cultural artefacts through which we as a social group derive meanings. In fact, the various subgroups and subcultures within a major society also engage with the media in some way to help them generate their own meanings and meaning-making processes and practices. Now, it's important to think about what the media is, because we often refer to the media, or many people often refer to the media as the corporate media, that big industrial network which is responsible for producing mass mediation, mass text, major newspaper text, major TV text, major broadcast materials. And people often assume that those major broadcast texts are all that there is in terms of the media and in terms of culture. Now, this is not necessarily the case. Certainly they are very important. They have greater access to the resources of meaning making than many other social groups do, and therefore their texts and presumably their latent meanings are distributed more broadly than other people's. However, the other side of the media is the consumer, or the people who receive and use those texts in some way to generate meanings. meaning is a much more active thing than just receiving those meanings as they're implied by or as they're generated by major media corporations. Media is also part of the process of generating text by audiences themselves. And I think this refers to the notion of cultural construction. In cultural construction, there are various powerful groups. The idea is that there are various powerful groups in a society, the media being, or the mass media being one of them, but other major corporations and the state itself and governments. These three major groups are primarily responsible for generating and constructing culture and therefore our broader or dominant belief systems. This is sometimes referred to as ideology, a concept that's been adapted from Karl Marx. Now, all this is important and necessary to understand, but equally we need to understand that other players are engaged in the creative generation of meaning. And these subgroups that I was talking about, these social groups, all are engaged in the production and distribution of meanings in some way. To give you an example of that, we can see different ethnic groups within a country like the US or the UK or Australia. Different ethnic groups have their own cultural practices and rituals which in some ways interact with and are part of and are engaged with the sort of broader, more dominant social formation, but they have their own special way of producing meaning and value for these social groups. It's not just ethnic groups, as I mentioned before, there are also different recreational groups, there are different sexual subgroups, all engaged in various practices of meaning making. And in some respects, this is where people and where the media are formed around these creative practices and creative processes. Look, I just want to conclude this conversation with giving some examples. So at the end of this tape we'll see some examples. And thanks very much for the conversation, Glenn.
Been a pleasure. Thanks, Jeff.